Hi, good evening. Welcome everybody to this evening's webinar. So this evening we are going to be discussing UK-Malaysia relations in the new normal of Brexit and COVID-19. And our guest this evening is His Excellency Charles Hay, MVO, who is the British High Commissioner to Malaysia. He took up the post in March 2019. Prior to Malaysia, Mr. Hay was the British Ambassador for South Korea from 2015 to 2018. During his time in the British diplomatic services, he has been posted to the Czech Republic, Spain, and the UK representation to the EU in Brussels. Charles was also the director of the consular services in London, responsible for assisting British nationals and in crisis management worldwide. Before joining the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in 1993, he was a captain in the British Army. Mr. Hay is married to Pascal Sutherland and they have two daughters. He has a master's in business administration as well as a BA in philosophy and politics. His hobbies include golf, diving, and archery. I'd just like to say, actually, at this point, that I'd really like to thank His Excellency for all the support that he's given the Society by attending many events, including many times with Pascal, and we've been honoured and we've greatly enjoyed spending time with you and being in your company. And we are especially pleased that you are still going to join us today, but this time for an online event. So, Mr. Charles Hay, thank you very much and welcome to our webinar.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Okay, let me just introduce your hosts for this evening. So you have two hosts, Dr. Elizabeth Lee and Faisal Arif. Dr. Elizabeth is an alumna of Bukit Bintang Girls' School as well as Wolfson College, Cambridge, where she obtained her Master's in Education, specialising in education, psychology, and particularly psycholinguistics. She's also a Doctor of Law at Nottingham University and has an honorary doctorate from Victoria University in Australia. She joined the Sunway Group in 1992 and has overseen its growth from just 1,000 students to over 30,000 students now, earning many Malaysian and Asian education and female leadership awards along the way. She's also the first female president of the Oxford and Cambridge Society and has been the bedrock of our society for many years. So thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Emma.
Faisal is the CEO of Border Pass, an award-winning startup that gets visitors through Malaysian airport immigration in seconds. He previously worked in the investment management industry in the UK, Singapore, Malaysia, along with stints in the United Nations in New York and the World Bank in Washington, D.C. He studied law at Cambridge University and Columbia University, where he was a Fulbright scholar. Many of you will remember Faisal from his superb toast to Cambridge at last year's boat race dinner. Faisal is also secretary of the Oxford and Cambridge Society Malaysia. So welcome, all three of you. I'm going to pass you over to our interviewers. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma, and welcome again to His Excellency Charles Hay. Thank you, sir, for joining us on this CMCO evening, which has brought us all online rather than face-to-face after that nice dinner we were talking about in a hotel somewhere, like we normally would have done. All this courtesy of the scourge of COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, it is this very pandemic which seems to have somewhat eclipsed much of the political debates within each of our individual countries, as I also note that the public discourse shifted from Brexit pandemonium to COVID-19 pandemic. But the deadline of 31st of December 2020 for the EU-UK negotiations over trade is fast approaching. Let's face it, many of us in this part of the world were surprised by the vitriolic rhetoric and one-upmanship battles during the acrimonious divorce, but we have been more surprised by how both the EU and the UK, in many respects, have actually struggled in their response to the COVID-19 outbreak. So, Charles, has COVID-19 shifted the power balance or changed the position of the two parties in the Brexit trade talks, or will there be another extension of the deadline to reach an agreement, or is a no-deal outcome more likely? actually, Your Excellency, where are we with Brexit?
Well, thank you for the question. So the fact is that we have a deal. We have an agreement on, if you like, the divorce terms of the UK and the EU. And that has been, so the UK has actually technically already left the European Union. And where we are now is in a transitional period. And the transitional period is due to end, as you say, at the end of this year. And the aim of that transitional period was to give both sides the opportunity to negotiate in detail the, if you like, the final relationship, or the relationship between the UK and the EU. And that's what's been going on. I mean, yes, it would be idle of me to say that COVID has had no effect on that, because the fact is that politicians the world over have found that a lot of their bandwidth has been taken up by managing the pandemic, which has been such a difficult issue to deal with, and there are no easy answers. However, I can report to you and the viewers that the negotiating teams on both sides, in the UK and the EU, have been hard at work negotiating. They've been doing that through virtual means rather than physically, but they've had several rounds of negotiations, and there's another one due later this month. And I think this month's one will be a key moment, because in theory, the UK could ask for an extension of the transitional period, effectively before the end of June. But my Prime Minister has been very clear that he's not minded to ask for an extension. And I think he believes that the logic of the negotiations is such that if you continue to push out the end date, then the negotiations will simply continue to fill the gap until you get to that end date. And in the EU, there is a bit of a tradition, a history of doing deals at the last minute, at the 5 minutes to midnight.
Yes.
And so there is still plenty of scope to do that.
Okay. Well, while Brexit may not be the source of racism, it has nonetheless alluded to higher levels of racism being expressed. Couple that to, of course, social media struggles to mitigate its undesired impact of normalizing hate and increasing division across societies. I mean, there are major concerns that as our world becomes more connected, societies are just becoming more insular and nationalistic. But a YouGov poll, I believe, conducted last week, found that in the light of Beijing's recent move to impose new far-reaching security laws, more Brits are actually supporting, I think it was something like 42%, than oppose, 24%, giving actually the British national overseas passport holders from Hong Kong greater rights to come and live in Britain. But of course, I think something about one third were actually undecided. Charles, how do these survey findings suggest, do these survey findings suggest a return to a more inclusive and pluralistic 21st century Britain?
Well, the discussions over Brexit were very polarizing and extremely difficult, as people will remember. And one of the major issues that was a part of that debate was the whole question of immigration. And that was driven largely by the numbers of people from the new member states, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, Bulgaria, and so on, who came to the UK. So, for example, 1 million Poles live in the UK or came to the UK. That is a huge number. Yeah. In a country of 60 million. And the fact is that in the EU, free movement of people is one of the so-called founding freedoms. And therefore, there are no, it's a wonderful thing in a way, because it means that any EU citizen can go and live and work in any other EU member state without any barriers. Right. So, and that's a very important part of the whole EU offer, if you like. But it became clear that large numbers of my country people were more and more uncomfortable with that, because they felt that the numbers were so great that actually it was making fundamental changes to our society, and also putting huge stress on our resources, on the health service, on schools. There were lots of stories about people being unable to get places for their kids because there weren't enough places in school. But it was interesting, though, because the polling data, when you look at it, of people who express real concerns about immigration, the highest numbers were in the places where there were, in fact, fewest actual immigrants. So if you look at the polling figures from London, from university cities, they were mainly against Brexit and had fewer problems with immigration, but it was, more isolated communities in the Midlands and Northwest and Northeast, where there were more people concerned about migrants coming to the UK. So, and don't forget also that the people who voted for Brexit, I think there were lots of reasons why people voted for it, but there were two major camps. One was a group of people who felt that the UK had become too open and too welcoming to migrants. But the other, a very significant group, which I think includes pretty much all of the political class, believed that the issue is that the EU was actually too constraining for us and it was holding us back. And in fact, my Prime Minister has talked about the UK becoming more global as a result of leaving the European Union. So that ties in very well with that evidence that you've just given for people's perspective on Hong Kong, people with BNO, and the possibility of them coming to stay in the UK. British people have not suddenly become racist and little Englanders. There's always, in every society, there's always a number of people who are like that. Every country in the world has them. I think what happened, though, as that debate became more live, people became much more aware of incidents of racism and incidents of these people doing foolish and unpleasant things. And so, if you like, the awareness grew rather than the reality.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. In fact, talking about schools, I'd like to ask a question on behalf of many of my ambitious students. Just as ambitious students around the world, the UK is actually a top choice destination to pursue higher education. And in fact, according to the UK Higher Education Statistics Agency, there were almost 500,000 international students who pursued their degree in the UK during 2017-2018 academic session, of which Malaysia was actually the 5th highest country of origin of non-EU students in the UK, with some 13,835 students to be precise. And this survey carried out, and there was also a survey carried out by study portals, which found that about 1 in 6 non-EU students is less likely to study in the UK because of Brexit, unfortunately. And Tim Bradshaw, the chief executive of the Russell Group, actually said that as the world recovers from the COVID-19 crisis, we have to expect numbers will fall for a while, and that competition from other countries will be even more fierce. So the multiple reports of recent COVID-19 associated xenophobic attacks of students of Chinese ethnicity probably has not helped the situation. But how do you think that the UK and Malaysian institutions can leverage their rich history of higher education collaboration in this current situation?
Well, one of the wonderful things about being in Malaysia is that it seems to me sometimes that pretty much everyone I meet has been to university or school, or sometimes both, in the UK. Yes. We think maybe about 500,000 Malaysians have had an educational experience in the UK. And of course, as you know, there are 5 British university campuses here in Malaysia, and many, many tie-ups between universities with Malaysian educational institutions, not least with Sunway University. So it is an incredibly rich heritage and a rich background. And as you say, Malaysians like going to the UK to study. And I think they like going there for all sorts of reasons. But one of the most important reasons, I believe, is the quality of the education that we provide. So if you look at the top 100 universities globally list, UK, we normally have 3 or 4 in the top 10. We normally have about 18 or so in the top 100, which is an absolutely remarkable thing when you think that we're a medium to small sized country. We definitely punch above our weight in the educational field, which is why we have so many international students. And I think the number of international students also provides a really fantastic experience for not just for the students who come to us from overseas, but also for the British students who study alongside. So they get a wonderful experience of exposure to international students while not having to leave the UK. Now, none of that's not going to change after Brexit. The UK government has made it very clear, in fact, that we want to encourage more foreign students to come and study in the UK after Brexit, after we leave the transitional period. And one of the things that I think will happen is that there's going to become a more level playing field for EU and non-EU students. So at the moment, EU students are charged the same as UK students, and then other foreign students are charged more. That, I think, will change. But what I don't think will change is the quality of the education that we'll offer. We won't change the fact that we offer that in English. COVID is definitely a complicating factor, and as you all have, you're obviously working here in how you're going to offer your education in the COVID period, but a number of British universities have already announced that there are going to be no physical lectures before the end of this calendar year. Now, that is problematic, I think, for students who are going to universities, because that takes away a lot of the experience, a lot of the opportunity to interact with other students and so on. But I think that's unavoidable, and I think that will be the case in every university in the world. So, if you like, it's a level playing field, although a less good one. There is more and more competition in the field, that is absolutely for sure. So what we see, for example, is more and more European countries that are offering degrees taught in English. So now you can go and study in the Netherlands, in Germany, in France, and you can study in English, because this is big business. It's very important. Educational exports to Malaysia are huge for the UK, and we need to keep offering that and it is a priority for my government to continue the offer of a quality education in the way that we always have.
Your Excellency, you mentioned that fees may change, will probably change. How exactly, do you have an idea when you say change? Is it going to go higher, or is it good news for us that it will come down? I mean, I do know for a fact that having spoken with the Vice Chancellor of the University of Cambridge during MCO, together with my chairman, he did mention that your UK government has said no change in fees, as in it's not coming down, even though it's online. But then you now have alluded to some change in fees, so I'm particularly interested in that.
Yes. One question that people often ask me is, well, now you've left the European Union, are you going to reintroduce the old Commonwealth preferences? Is it going to become cheaper for Malaysians to go and study in the UK? So I think what the Vice Chancellor was probably referring to is the capped fees for UK students. And I don't think that cap is going to change. The fees for international students are set by the universities, I think, and it's going to be up to them to decide how they do that. And obviously it will depend on the institution. I mean, the top institutions, the Russell Group, Oxford and Cambridge, they will be able to, I'm sure, continue to charge the same fees as they did before. The difference is they'll be able to charge them for European Union students as well.
Not good news for them.
So that's the change. There'll be no preference given to European Union students. But hand on heart, I would love to be able to announce now that it's all going to get a lot cheaper, but I don't think it will. But the quality will still be there. And I was looking at some surveys preparing for this, and there was one that was done recently. The question was, were you content with your experience in the UK university, and has it helped you get a job? And I think 83% of alumni said that it had. So that's pretty good, I think.
Yeah. Yes, it is indeed very good. I'd like to move on to a question on research, if I may, sir. According to KPMG, in 2019, they had this Technology Innovation Hubs report. The UK actually ranks third behind the US and China amongst all the countries expected to produce the most disruptive technologies. And a tradition of research and development coupled with large mega projects and initiatives such as Innovate UK has continued to position the UK as one of the most innovative ecosystems in the world. However, the recent COVID-19 crisis in the UK reminds us that the solutions to these grand challenges actually require global perspectives and collaborations. The ability to improve our preparedness for future global crises will certainly be dependent on strong international collaborations between countries and the strengthening of obviously local capacity. Now, on this front, we have had the Newton Unku Omar Fund since 2014, and that has promoted partnerships on innovation and research translation between the UK academic institutions and Malaysian higher education institutions, not to mention also the small and business enterprises. Now, how do you rate the success of these projects yourself?
Well, let me start by doing a little bit of an advertisement for UK research and innovation. And it comes back to your Brexit point. A lot of people have said, you know, it's going to have a terrible impact on research. And the fact is that to do good research now is an international enterprise, right? So in the UK, if you look at the way that we do our research, I think about half of the PhD students in the UK are not British. About a third of the staff in universities are not British. And about a third of our Nobel Prize winners also are not British. But we're terribly proud of the fact that the UK has more Nobel Prizes than any country except for the US. And when you look at the European research, very big European research funds, the UK always secures a disproportionately large amount. And, you know, I could go on telling you about how UK papers with a UK researcher appear in 30% of the top 100 of the most cited research papers, blah, blah, blah. One good thing that has come out of the Brexit debate is a much greater awareness, I think, in the public, but also amongst some politicians, of the importance of science and innovation in the UK. And what that has led to, in fact, oddly enough, is even more funding being promised to go into science and innovation. And the government has said that they will make good the money that we're going to lose through not having access to EU research money in future, which is very good news. There is still the possibility of us signing up to EU programs like the Horizon 2020 program. All that is part of the negotiations that are going on at the moment. And let's not forget also that you know, I mentioned earlier that one of the things that people felt when they ticked that box to leave the European Union was that the EU was very constrictive. And if you look at the science and innovation area, I think there is some evidence to that. So, for example, EU research funds are great, but they do, it's designed to promote cooperation between EU countries. Whereas in fact, you need to be cooperating with all countries, not just with the EU, and increasingly with China, of course. The US researchers are the UK's largest partner in science already, so we can expect to see that increasing. So I think there'll be more and more opportunities for non-EU researchers to work with UK researchers. The other thing that happens in the EU is there are very strict rules about some areas of research. So, for example, doing research on GMO is very difficult. It's very difficult to do stem cell research. And there are whole other areas where leaving the European Union, not being part of these programs, will actually allow our scientists to do more, if you like. And it'll be up to the UK to decide how to determine the regulations and rules that surround that research. There's also opportunities to boost more research involving the private sector. So at the moment, the EU rules are that if more than a small percentage of research is from a commercial partner, then, for example, you don't get VAT relief on the money you spend. That's a decision the UK could decide to change that. You know, so it gives us much more scope. I'm very proud of the Newton and Omar Fund. It's a great way that we can encourage and incentivize British and Malaysian researchers to work together on a whole range of different projects. I've seen some of it in action, and it's really impressive. I was in London just before the COVID lockdown. I called on Venki Ramakrishnan, who's the head of the Royal Society. He briefed me on the Commonwealth Science Initiative. And again, there's opportunities for the UK and Malaysia to work together much more through that. So I'm really optimistic, actually, about the future of UK science and innovation and UK-Malaysian partnership. And let me also advertise to people who don't know about it, a wonderful Royal Society. It was part of the Royal Society, but now it's independent, in the Danang Valley in Sabah. It's the Southeast Asian Rainforest Research Project. I visited it end of last year. They do the most fantastic research on rainforests of global significance. The majority of the research projects are through UK universities, and it's just a really great example of really important science being done here in Malaysia, and let's find more areas to do that together.
Excellent. Great. I'm really looking forward to all this. I think I should pass you over to my partner, Faisal.
Okay.
All right. Hey, Charles, thanks for joining us today. Welcome onto the show. I've got a few questions on trade, but before I launch into them, you mentioned that COVID-19 has very much been the focus of government lately, and not so much Brexit. In your view, does the pandemic increase the risk of a no-deal Brexit happening?
Well, we don't talk about a no-deal Brexit because the deal is done. What we're talking about now is what kind of trade arrangements we're going to have with the European Union. And there's a kind of a spectrum. So we talk about a Canada-style deal, which is what we're aiming at. And that's shorthand for effectively a deep, but if you like, conventional FTA. And we think there's absolutely no reason why we can't achieve that between now and the end of the year, because we have all the UK government has published an outline of what we think that should look like or could look like. We think it's perfectly doable, but the European Union is in a different place. They want to find a lot more, if you like, regulatory adhesion from the UK to existing and future EU rules and regulations. They want to have an oversight role for the European Court of Justice. That's something that we're not very keen on. They want continued access to UK fishing waters, which again is problematic for us. So, if none of that is achieved, then what we will end up with is, what people are calling an Australia-type deal, which is shorthand for trading on WTO terms after the end of the year, which is not something that either side wants, because it would involve some economic loss, undoubtedly, to both sides.
All right. Let's shift over to UK and Malaysia's trading relationship. We've had a long-standing one, as you're well aware. Today it involves everything from palm oil, rubber gloves, fighter jets, London real estate vacuum cleaners, and less obvious ones like British cabbage, which you mentioned in your interview in The Edge recently. While we have all that, there are headwinds and maybe some might say opportunities. We see how Huawei and Hong Kong may possibly lead to UK companies looking for a new manufacturing base outside of China, for example. COVID-19 has boosted our rubber glove trade. Then there's Brexit happening and this new UK ASEAN embassy in Jakarta as well. With all that backdrop happening, there's a lot of changes there. Where does Malaysia stand in terms of trade deals with the UK? There'll be a queue of different countries. And will that be a relationship that's a standalone relationship, or will you go through ASEAN as a bloc?
Yeah, well, great question. So Malaysia is already a very important trading partner, as you say, with a two-way trade and investment relationship, partnership worth about £5 billion a year. It's interesting that COVID has changed a lot of things. One thing it has done is raised awareness globally of the importance of Malaysia as a manufacturer and producer of rubber gloves, with I think 60 to 65% of the world's share. That came as a big surprise to people in the UK, I can tell you. But one thing I think that is fantastic is that your companies have been able to keep up the production and the flow of gloves, which is obviously essential for the National Health Service as it is to everybody else. So I want to commend your manufacturing capability for being able to do that. So £5 billion, Malaysia, second biggest market in ASEAN for us after Singapore. But frustratingly, we always feel that we should be doing better. We should be doing more here. We have a great shared history. It's had its ups and downs, but generally speaking, I think there's affection on both sides. We got that wonderful educational relationship. So many Malaysians know the UK so well, having been educated there. I think one of the problems that we have in the UK is that the knowledge and understanding of Malaysia, oddly enough, is becoming less good in the UK over the years. You know, we see frustratingly few British nationals coming to study in Malaysia. So there just isn't the same depth of knowledge and understanding that there should be. And I was very excited about the Malaysian government's proposal for a 2020 tourism promotion, big tourism promotion in the UK, because I thought that would help raise the awareness of Malaysia in the UK, and not just the beautiful beaches and all the rest of it, but also the manufacturing sector and the cutting edge of quite a lot of what we do here, because there's a lot of cutting edge stuff that's going on here. So, for example, in aeronautical engineering, you mentioned fighter jets, the Hawk program, that brought with it manufacturing as an offset, which has thrived since then. And Rolls-Royce, who make engines, civil aviation engines in Singapore, they procure the engine casings from a company in Malaysia, for example. And that's not metal bashing, this is really, really high-tech engineering. There's a lot of interest in UK companies in investment in Malaysia, and I'm delighted that a company called Smith & Nephew, they are working on a new factory facility in Penang. Smith & Nephew make medical devices. They're probably best known for their bandages and plasters, but what they're doing in Malaysia is they're establishing a factory which will make knee joints, hip joints, and this is a growing area. As we all get older, we all need artificial hips and knees. The China market is going to be huge, and these are not simple things. These require highly skilled engineers. So I asked Smith & Nephew, why have you come to Malaysia? Why are you investing here? And they said the big thing was the availability of a well-educated workforce who could be trained in advanced production techniques to produce these things. Malaysia is not a country now where people will come to establish low-cost manufacturing, because you're not in that space. You're not low wage. But you are in a sort of sweet spot for high-end manufacturing. That's why Dyson are here. They've got lots of factories. I think they employ about 11,000 people here in Malaysia. They have some of their R&D stuff going on here as well. I was talking to another British company, software company, that's just opened an office here. They're employing 50 or 60 people. Again, I said, why are you here? And they said, because we can get fantastic software engineers here, and you know, we pay them a good salary by Malaysian standards, but they're a quarter of the cost that we would face in the US or the UK. And in any case, we can't recruit people like this in the UK anymore, they say. So, you know, there are lots of reasons why people are coming to Malaysia. And I think there's a lot of scope to do more of that. As to whether we'll be negotiating any new trade arrangements, we are now a member of the WTO in our own right. We've taken up our seat in the WTO. We're now in the process of negotiating FTAs, well, firstly with the European Union, which is, you know, the biggest one, if you like. Also, we're negotiating now with the US. That negotiation was launched a couple of weeks ago. We're also looking at negotiating with Australia, New Zealand, maybe Japan. That's a lot to do. So as you rightly say, there's a kind of a queue out there. And one of the advantages in the fact there's no existing EU-Malaysia FTA is that we haven't lost anything by leaving the European Union here. But we can see a lot of things that we can do to boost trade and investment, which is why our two governments have decided to set up a joint committee to look at all these issues in detail. Of course, that was agreed by the last government. We've had to go through a bit of a process of just reaffirming that the new government is interested in carrying on with that, which they are. So we need to press on and establish that and get it up and running.
Yeah, I might be a little rusty on the history books, but if I'm not mistaken, the rubber plantations that we have in Malaysia were actually planted by the British.
Yes, and so were the palm oil plantations.
Right. Yeah. There was a dawn raid and things like that.
Which I didn't talk about.
Yeah, we nicked it back. So the other bit of interesting history that I dug up was that the N95 mask was invented by a Malayan from Penang, and he was the first person of Chinese origin to attend Cambridge.
Oh, is that right? I didn't know it.
That's another, as you were, maybe British contribution to the world. Yeah, you did mention about doing more, and sort of like we've had lots of government changes, almost as many as Australia in recent years. How does that affect the sort of diplomatic negotiations continuity? Is it mainly with the civil service, or do the politicians play a very big part in terms of shaping policies going forwards?
Politicians, of course, play a huge role. And they set the overall priorities, the overall agenda, and take the decisions. But for most countries, and maybe for all countries, trading and investment is a pretty constant thing. I mean, the strengths in Malaysia's different sectors don't change because the government changes, and the same is true of the UK. So whatever government is in power in the UK, the education sector is as important as it always has been to us, and the same is true to Malaysia. I mean, of course, different governments will introduce different rules and regulations, and that can have an effect on business. I think Malaysian governments tend to be pretty business friendly, actually, and I very much hope that this government and future governments we have to do with will continue in that vein.
Sure. You've been here for about a year and a bit. Are there any sort of glaring opportunities that you really wish either British businesses or Malaysian businesses would sort of go into? You mentioned that you've got Smith and Nephew with knee joints and things like that, and then I'm just trying to think of other things that we can possibly do together. Dyson made some ventilators for the NHS that turned out to be surplus requirements, whether that can be manufactured in Malaysia as well. And anything that you see that, over the past year or so, that we should be working harder at, or policymakers should be focusing on more.
Well, I have to say that I think the people that you have who are involved in attracting investment from the UK and elsewhere do a pretty good job. I mean, Invest KL, I think, is a good outfit, and Invest Penang and all the other. So I've had lots of presentations, and I think you have a quality service there, which does make it's important to make it attractive for investors coming in. As to what more can be done, there are lots of small things that can be done. I think the big issue for us as the UK is that our major sector now is in services, and services are the most complicated thing of all to include in any kind of trade agreement. They tend to be very complex. They can often run into vested interests in the country concerned. So let me give you one example of where I found my arguments falling on stony ground, which is the liberalization of the legal services market in Malaysia. So at the moment, as you may know, there are two foreign law firms operating in Malaysia. They're both British, but they're heavily constrained in what they can do. And when I talk to the Malaysian Bar Association about this, they say, yes, but we don't want lawyers coming in and taking our work and putting lawyers out of business and so on and so forth. But what we found in the UK is that by opening up our legal services market, actually we've created a bigger market with more for everybody. So, for example, there are 200 foreign law firms in London alone, including one Malaysian. And our legal services market is growing year by year by year. And what it in practice means in Malaysia is that the legal services companies are guarding their turf, but they're missing out on a lot of other opportunities. So, for example, if you want to do a big deal that involves, an oil and gas field or an international trade agreement, you won't come to a Malaysian law firm, generally speaking, because they don't have the expertise, because they don't do that. You will call in a UK law firm, a Singaporean law firm, US law firm, whatever it might be. And I think it's also depriving young Malaysian lawyers of the opportunity to work in on that bigger field. If they want to do that, they have to go and work in the UK or in the US or Australia or whatever. And a lot of them do. We have a lot of Malaysian lawyers working in London. So there's no shortage of talent. And this is what these two British law firms tell me. They say we can recruit as many people as we want here, of excellent quality. But the issue is that we're not allowed to do the transactional work. So I think it's a mistake for Malaysia not to open up that sector. And the same is true of a number of other service sectors. So, we've got British insurers here, we've got British banks here, and they're doing pretty well. They're quite big in some cases, but there's opportunities for them to do more if there could be some relaxation to allow more of these service companies to come into Malaysia.
Those are very interesting points, and I quite agree on the legal front. I nearly became a lawyer myself, so I nearly practiced in the US. I did my bar exam and everything there, but I didn't practice. Anyway, the other thing that you mentioned just now was palm oil. And I've been reading up in the news something about new sustainability due diligence requirements for palm oil exporters to the UK. That's led by the Department of Environment, Food, Rural Affairs, DEFRA, and some of the commentators have been saying that the EU will take the UK's lead on how the treatment for palm oil exporters to the UK. And I thought that's very interesting. Now that Brexit's happened, the UK ends up taking the lead in terms of policy there. And I think that the real question for Malaysia is, how do we make sure that we are in the UK's good books, given the potential implications to our broader sort of relationship with the EU?
Yes, I mean, the first thing I should say is that the UK government is very aware of the importance of palm oil to Malaysia, representing 4% of your exports, and you're the second biggest global producer. But there are a number of different things going on here. So the latest kind of round of disputes over palm oil with the EU are to do with a biofuels directive, which would end up making it harder to include palm oil as a biofuel. The UK government position on that is that we don't think that it's right to use oils like palm oil as biofuels, because they are useful for other purposes. And the aim of biofuels is to reduce carbon emissions, and therefore a better way of doing that is to use waste products. So, for example, the waste material from palm oil production could be used to make biofuels, and that would be a very effective thing to do. Now, as the UK is leaving the European Union, it's up to us to decide what our policy will be on palm oil and biofuels. So we need to decide whether we follow that EU lead in this case, or whether we forge a different policy. I mean, the demand for palm oil is driven by consumers and by businesses, not by governments. And the fact of the matter is that at the moment, not just in the UK, but probably across Europe and North America as well, palm oil has got a pretty bad rep. And it is held responsible for deforestation, for loss of biodiversity, loss of habitat. Now, I know very well that Malaysia has been doing a huge amount on palm oil to make it, if you like, forest friendly. So you have the RSPO certification of sustainability, which includes specifics about non-deforestation. You've also got the Malaysian standard MSPO. So a lot has been doing on sustainability. And I think what we need to do together, the UK and Malaysian governments, along probably with Indonesia, and it's not just about palm oil, it's about any product that can lead to deforestation. So it also needs to look at, for example, soy, it needs to look at beef, cocoa, and so on and so forth. And I think for it to be effective, the producer countries need to work with the consumer countries to prevent deforestation. Now, the big link here, and why the UK government is very focused on this, is with climate change. And the UK is hosting the next round of climate change negotiations, COP26. It was meant to be this November in Glasgow. Obviously, because of COVID, it's being put back to next November, and the dates have just been agreed. And a big part of that, of the work that we're taking forward on climate change, is about what's been called natural solutions. And one of those really important natural solutions is to do with forests, because forests are massive carbon sinks. Forests are, the amount of carbon that they store varies. So the most carbon storage you get is in, for example, peat forests of the kind that you have in some places in Malaysia. For example, the Raja Musa Forest Reserve, which is a Commonwealth Queen's canopy, which I visited a few months ago, that is the most important storage of carbon, being deep peat, wet peat forests. In the forest I was mentioning earlier on in the Danang Valley, again, that's a massive carbon store. So protecting these forests and developing them as carbon stores is a really important part of addressing climate change. So all those things come together so that we need to work together to prevent the loss of any more forest and to improve the quality of the forest that we have.
Charles, thanks for all that. I'm going to hand you back over to Elizabeth because we've got some questions from the audience and we'd like to try to keep things a bit interactive. So back to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those questions, Faisal and Charles. Great answers. We've got some enthusiastic questions that have been posted up. Let me start with our former, past president, immediate past president, Mark Disney has a question here. He says, do you worry that people outside the UK conflate Boris and Trump? Do they still resonate positively in Malaysia, ASEAN, and the world in general? I mean, that's a typical Mark Disney question.
And I'm going to give you a typical civil servant answer, which is that I can't possibly comment on my political masters because, you know, my official computer would ping with my, resignation letter a minute later. So I'm afraid I can't possibly comment on any of that.
Very diplomatic indeed. Well, Faris has a much more, a better question. I won't say better, but much easier to answer.
Answerable.
Answerable question. He says many Brits are stuck abroad currently with families in lockdown in Malaysia. Has the British Embassy assisted with negotiating an early entry into Malaysia to help reunite families? I mean, we talked about that earlier on, so maybe you can tell the rest.
Yeah, this is, I think it's probably my biggest concern at the moment, which is, so not just British nationals, but all sorts of non-Malaysians who have different kinds of long-term living visas, like Malaysia, my second home. And when the lockdown happened, they were outside Malaysia and they've been unable to get back in. And we have been making representations. I've done it myself with the Prime Minister and with the Immigration Services. I've worked with a number of other ambassadors. We've made joint representations. And those representations, I think, have been fully reflected on by the Malaysian government, but they have concluded for their policy reasons that to make the lockdown as effective as possible, they have decided that they are not going to allow any more than a small, so people with permanent residency can get back in, but basically others cannot for the meantime. Now that is a decision taken by the Malaysian government, and obviously every government has the duty to protect its people, protect its borders, and take the decisions necessary. The UK government, as people probably heard, is about to introduce a quarantine arrangement for people arriving from outside the UK. That has been criticised, but again, every government has to make decisions which will be unpopular with certain groups of people, and that's just we're all trying to work through the COVID crisis as best we can, taking the decisions that will have the desired output, which is to reduce the rate of infection.
Charles, I'm just a bit curious. Have there been any talks about the possibility of mutual recognition of COVID-19 testing? Say, if a UK traveler gets tested in the UK and they're given the all clear, they can skip the 14-day period in Malaysia and vice versa. Obviously, there are a lot of technicalities on the test method and auditing each other's testing and all that. But has there been any conversation at all on something like that?
So I think all that is under consideration, and the WHO is looking at all of this. But I think the problem at the moment is that there's still some uncertainty about how effective the testing actually is, because you do have asymptomatic carriers of COVID. And sometimes you can, people have been exposed to the virus, they've been tested, they're clear, but then they fall ill, a couple of days later. I just don't think we know enough yet. But I'm absolutely certain that that is going to be the next step, because nobody wants to have a quarantine arrangement. It's complicated, it's difficult, it's expensive, it causes problems for business, problems for families, it's unpopular. Why would you have it if there was an alternative? And I think we're going to get to that alternative maybe in the coming months.
Yeah, but Your Excellency, I remember our Director General of Health actually saying that asymptomatic people do not spread. There may be carriers, but they do not spread COVID onto someone else, which I find extremely surprising, but at the same time very happy about such news. So maybe it isn't a worry after all.
Maybe not, but this is still a very, very new disease. So and the resources globally that have been put into understanding this and working on a vaccine are just colossal. And yet there is still some, what seemed to me as a non-scientist layman, some basic unknowns about the disease. That it all seems very puzzling. But we can't second guess our scientists, can we?
Yeah, no, that's true. So much unknown about this disease. Honestly speaking, it's so uncertain itself. Talk about talk about looking for a vaccine. It may not even work for long. Well, we've got the question here from Sharifa Bakar Ali, and she says travel quarantine rules is that they're going to restrict travel in and out of the UK, and it will also impact cross-border businesses for the UK. Do you see it being relaxed quickly, even if it is imposed next week?
Well, it's a good question. I don't think anybody knows the answer to this yet. I can only say that there's a process in place whereby it will be regularly reviewed, I think every 3 weeks. And if the conditions change and it's no longer necessary, or we can replace it with some other regime, then I'm sure that we can. I mean, on the vaccines thing, interestingly, I don't know how many people will have seen it, but yesterday there was a global vaccine summit. And that global vaccine summit, which was hosted by the UK, raised about $8.8 billion for vaccine research, which is much more than was aimed for. And it just goes to show the kind of international cooperation and the kinds of resources that are being pumped into vaccine research at this moment.
Absolutely. And I know that there's been a lot of news about Oxford, streaming ahead with the vaccine. And at the same time, I do know for a fact that, there's a lot of research work on this itself in the Jeffrey Chia building in Cambridge. So, most exciting stuff ahead.
Another one from Mark. Mark asking, what does His Excellency think the UK can learn from Malaysia's remarkably successful handling of COVID? Why such a huge difference in the impact? I'd take it one step further and also ask, could Malaysia's handling of COVID, our management of COVID, be a potential competitive advantage going forwards?
Yeah, well, I think that your government has done a great job on managing COVID. I remember back when the lockdown was announced, I have to say my initial reaction was, this seems very draconian, all of a sudden to go that far. But in fact, it achieved its objective, which was to reduce the spread of infection. Malaysia's not out of the woods yet. Of course, nobody is. There might be, spikes. Every government has had to do that incredibly difficult balancing act between how much economic activity do you allow, or how much of a lockdown do you have with the resulting damage to the economy. And different governments have taken different decisions, and I'm sure many doctorates are going to be written on different government approaches, different countries' approaches. And I think another important thing to bear in mind when looking at this, and my last posting was in Korea, as mentioned. Korea is a country that's been held up as being an excellent exemplar. of managing COVID. And yet they've allowed, they didn't have a lockdown in the same way that, for example, Malaysia did. And I think you also have to look at different cultures. In Korea and Japan, you know, physical distance is part of the culture. You know, people always wore masks when they had colds. That was part of the culture. You know, shaking hands is less common. So there are lots of things you can point to. And I think one of the issues that the British government had to deal with was how would British people react to going into a lockdown of the kind that, for example, was imposed here in Malaysia. And the lockdown in the UK was never as rigid as here. For example, people were allowed to go out and exercise. So at the beginning, people were encouraged not to go to pubs and restaurants, but the pubs and restaurants were not closed. Now, you might say, in retrospect, that was the wrong approach, and that it should have been a much more rigid lockdown. The pubs and restaurants should have been closed from the first day. But the government had to try to work out what would be acceptable to the British people, because to ask the police to impose something that is being flouted by a majority of people, it basically leads to civil unrest and enormous difficulty. So there are all these things that were having to be thought through by all the governments concerned. So, you know, there will be lots of lessons that are being learned even as we speak.
I mean, hindsight is always 2020. So, you know, it's one of those things, I guess. We've got one question in closing from Patrick, and it says, Charles, what have you started doing in the lockdown that you will continue doing when the lockdowns are over?
Well, that's, you know, I've been doing a lot of things differently in the lockdown compared to normal. So I've been spending a lot more time with my kids, which has been fantastic. And I'll certainly try to do that, although I suspect that as soon as life becomes normal again, then all the pressures will come back. I've been doing a lot more reading compared to what I was doing before, and I would like to carry on with that. I'm actually a lot fitter because I've been exercising in the garden with the kids. And again, I really need to keep on with that. And what I found, I mean, I suppose we've all been through this process, that here we are having this chat, and you know, it's a fantastic thing to do, and then we can switch off our screens and go and have dinner with our families. We haven't had to go anywhere to do this, so we've actually done a great thing. And I've had lots of meetings with people that I wouldn't normally have had meetings with through Zoom, so for example, I had a great Zoom meeting with Tun Mahathir, you know, which was a fantastic thing to do. And you know, it's always difficult to get meetings with people, but if you're doing a Zoom call, then all you need is half an hour. You don't have to travel all the way out to Putrajaya. So I think we should, in future, even when COVID is vanquished in whatever way it is vanquished, we should do a lot more virtual stuff in addition to the physical stuff. I don't think virtual can ever replace physical, but it's definitely got an important part to play.
Elizabeth? Oh, Emma, okay.
Yeah, lovely answer. And yeah, I hope we all do keep to these things that we've started doing in lockdown, that we know are good for our minds and our relationships and our souls. And yeah, that's one positive thing. Fantastic answers, very diplomatic at certain points. It was interesting to watch a diplomat tackling some of those questions despite being poked to answer certain things by Mark Disney. And yeah, and just positive as well. You know, this, you know, I'm Brit, I've been here, I've got PR, all my family's Malaysian, and it's an incredibly important relationship between Malaysia and the UK, and it's great to hear that whatever's happening with the UK and Europe, that Malaysia's relationship with the UK is going to go from strength to strength, and I think that's we're going to benefit from that, and that's a great thing for Malaysia. So it was really great to hear positive things in this environment. Yeah. So Charles Hay, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for answering all of our questions on a wide range of different topics. Thank you to Dr. Elizabeth Lee for your questions. Thank you to Faisal for your questions as well. And he seems to have disappeared just there. And I apologize for all the various things going on in the YouTube link. Our tech guy, Sean, had a power cut, so I was in charge of the pictures going over into YouTube. So I apologize if they're a bit weird in parts. Please do all share the link on YouTube, and we have another webinar next Wednesday at 4 p.m. with the British Council talking about the important question of education in the UK. Really important as students hit that UCAS deadline, important webinar. So again, Charles, thank you so much for joining us and for all of your answers and insights. Thank you.
Charles.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Have a good weekend, guys. Good long weekend.
Yeah.
Stay
Bye.
safe.